What's up, and welcome to another edition of Locked On NBA, the biggest stories with the local experts. I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, also host of Locked On Rockets right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Today, we're chatting with Evan Dammarell from Locked On Cavs as the Cleveland Cavaliers striking a blockbuster deal for former Utah Jazz star guard Donovan Mitchell. What does this do for the Cleveland Cavaliers? How will Donovan Mitchell pair with Darius Garland in the Cleveland backcourt? How does this adjust the timeline and the expectations for the Cavaliers moving forward this season? We're going to talk about that in just a moment after a quick message from our friends over at Built Bar. Because look, when it comes to protein bars, you got to check out Built Bar. They're the number one protein bar on the market, and for a very good reason. Every single bar is coated in 100% delicious chocolate. They're not gritty or chalky like other protein bars out there. They're soft, they're easy to chew, and they have so many incredible flavors to choose from. Look, you got raspberry, salted caramel, strawberry, mint brownie, peanut butter, cookies and cream. My personal favorite is the coconut brownie chunk, but you really can't go wrong with any single bar on their menu. Every single bar is low cal, low sugar, high protein, high fiber. Amazing if you're on a keto diet. Amazing if you're trying to maybe cut back a little bit, lose a little bit of weight. And you can check them out. Just go to built.com and use promo code LOCK15 to get 15% off your very next order of the absolute best tasting protein bars on the market. Again, that's promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at built.com. Joining us now is Evan Dammarell from Locked On Cavs. You can follow on Twitter at @amnot. Evan, the Cleveland Cavaliers picking up Donovan Mitchell in another. There have been a couple blockbuster moves this summer with star players on the move, but trading with the Utah Jazz, sending out Collin Sexton via sign and trade, Lauri Markkanen, Ochai Agbaji, and 3 firsts, 2 swaps. Quite a haul for Donovan Mitchell. Let's start, before we get into what this means for the Cavaliers organization moving forward, what Donovan Mitchell brings to this Cavaliers team. How do you feel about the overall price for Donovan Mitchell, the outgoing assets that Cleveland had to give up to make this trade happen?
So I've kind of debated this internally for a while. And if you're the Cavs, you have 2 all-stars on your roster in Darius Garland and Jarrett Allen. You have a guy who's ascending in Evan Mobley, who you can make a case could be an all-star in the foreseeable future as well. And players of Donovan Mitchell's caliber, who, depending on how everyone else feels, I think he's a top 20 player in this league, arguably one of the best players at his position overall. Like, when they become available, you have to really take a long and hard consideration into saying, okay, in our heart of hearts, is this guy going to maximize our potential in a very strong Eastern Conference? Because let us not forget, there's Boston, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Miami, Brooklyn, even though they're a bit of a wild card, Atlanta. There's a lot of good teams in the East this year. And if the Cavs kind of want to push themselves into that conversation out of the play-in, you have to really weigh your options here. And yes, people can kind of say, oh, they had something similar to that in Collin Sexton. And I hardcore disagree with that argument. We can get into it if you want later. But I think it was worth the price if in your heart of hearts it does make your team better and it pushes you further into the conversation out of the play-in tournament and into the playoff talk instead. Because let's be frank, before this trade, the Cavs probably were optimistically a top 6 team, and now they could be flirting with top 4 if they really just maximize their youth and take advantage of some of the older teams in the East as well. But at least now they have a dog in the fight in this conversation, and it's a little surreal to think that now instead of 3 all-stars in their starting lineup, they have 4, and now small forward is just the biggest mystery for Cleveland, as it was before this Donovan Mitchell trade.
I'm glad you brought up Collin Sexton there, because I think he, and maybe you'll agree, maybe you want to push back on this, but I think he got paid a little bit more than what people were expecting here with this deal as part of the sign and trade on the way over to Utah. But that was one of the components that had to come to fruition, right? Because the Jazz had to agree on that salary, the Cavs had to agree on it, and ultimately Sexton had to be okay with that contract and be okay with being dealt to Utah. So how good was it to actually see that situation come to a positive resolution, one that really helps the Cavs moving forward? And you mentioned kind of the comparison there between Sexton and what Donovan Mitchell brings to the table. How much of an upgrade is this at that position for Cleveland?
So last time I was on here, we actually talked about Collin Sexton's just contract situation as a whole, and the number floating around in the ether that I've heard, many of others heard, it was about $13.3 million annually, which is pretty much the absolute max the Cavs could sign Collin to without going to the luxury tax threshold, and they were still mindful of that. They were able to avoid the luxury tax when they acquired Donovan Mitchell as well, which is savvy cap management on the Cavs' part. But for me, at least, when I heard Collin in the grand scheme of things, like a lot of teams had him pegged at his absolute cap, 18.5 million overall, like annually. If you just did like a flat rate, if you break down this contract from Utah, it's 72 million over 4 years. It's about 18-ish million annually. I think Bobby Marks reported that it's a backloaded deal, so it'll be a little lighter at the beginning, then it'll be heavier towards the end, which is, all more power to Collin. There was a lot of uncertainties around him heading into this offseason. Again, something we talked about, and that's kind of working in Cleveland's favor, at least in these negotiations, was he's coming off a pretty serious torn meniscus. Like, it took him a while to get back on the court. We haven't seen him play in almost a calendar year. He only had 11 games under his belt. We don't know how he looked on a winning team. There's so many different variables and factors at play here. And the issue was, because he was a restricted free agent, not a lot of teams were going to be lining up to begin with to try and maybe fight the Cavs in this RFA battle. And teams with cap space were Indiana and San Antonio by the time this trade happened. And I see neither team really hardcore going after Collin. And Utah was always floated in the ether as a team who was interested in him. I think Jake Fisher was the first to report it, and a lot of people can corroborate it after the fact. But I'm happy for Collin. I'm happy he got paid. I think, again, as we talked about, the knee injury could not have come at a worse time for him, especially because the Cavs went on such like a dramatic run even after he went down, that he kind of bet on himself last off season, and then unfortunately had the knee injury and lost a lot of guaranteed money, and obviously saw a smaller contract because of it. So him to kind of get closer to 20-ish million, especially because he considers himself a starting guard and his agency considers himself a starting guard, like, that's great. I am always a proponent of players getting paid, especially when this is becoming a multi-billion-dollar league and the salary cap is definitely going to go up in the next few years. So this contract of Collin Sexton is going to be a small potato as soon as the new TV deal comes out as well. So I'm not too pressed on the overall price tag that he signed, but I'm happy he was able to get more of the money he was comfortable with, and I think end up ultimately in a situation where he can maybe rehabilitate his image as well and show that he is still one of the better guards at his position, especially in terms of scoring, just as an elite 3-level scorer. But to your point, with Donovan Mitchell coming in, I wrote about this a little bit, and I think the best way to put this is Donovan Mitchell is a real-life, self-actualized version of what the Cavs wanted with Collin Sexton, where you could talk about their true scoring numbers, or you could break down the percentages and everything else. Like, yeah, they're pretty comparable, but the way they got their buckets were pretty dramatically different, where Donovan really likes to thrive or beyond the arc. And yes, he has plenty of attacks inside the arc as well, especially at the rim, with like high flying dunks and everything else. But with Collin, it was mostly in the mid range. It was mostly at the basket. It was mostly at the free throw line, where, and you can correct my math if I'm wrong here, 3 is greater than 2. And if you're the Cavs and you're a team that is a proponent of playing 2 7-footers at the 4 and the 5, having that extra spacing, especially at the 2 guard spot and on the perimeter, helps so much more and helps you in spades when you're trying to really take this next step. So it's the shooting aspect. I think it's the scoring punch. I think he's going to relieve a lot of the defensive pressure Darius Garland faced last year, because Collin Sexton just is not on the same plane as Donovan Mitchell. Like I said, Mitchell's a top 20 player and Sexton isn't getting paid like a top 20 player. So we can discuss that as he won as well, but there's a lot of semantics can go around with Collin Sexton. His fans are a sensitive bunch, but either way, I am a proponent of this trade. I'm a fan of it. And also it's the playmaking stuff too. I think there's a lot of interesting wrinkles the Cavs can kind of get creative with this. I think also, when you just look at how the Caris LeVert trade went down last season and how the Cavs are just kind of positioning themselves, they couldn't really afford to wait and see, okay, is Caris LeVert really going to be the help that Darius Garland needs on the perimeter in terms of just defensive pressure? Can Collin Sexton be that after a serious knee injury? Like the Cavs can't afford to do that, because the future is kind of now for them, because they just make Garland the highest paid player in franchise history. I mean, in terms of his contracts, and you really got to accelerate things a little bit. And I don't think strict trading for a star necessarily accelerates it to an extent. There's a lot of other pieces that have to work in favor for Cleveland, but it's a good fit for the Cavs overall. Like I give it 2 thumbs up. I don't think it's going to make them, instant NBA champs. This isn't LeBron finagling to get Kevin Love to join him in Kyrie Irving kind of situation, but it's definitely going to set up Cleveland pretty for at least the 3 to the next 4 years, depending on what Mitchell wants to do with this last year of his contract.
It's also, and for what it's worth, I absolutely love this trade for Cleveland. Like I think this is exactly what you want to see out of a team that, maybe surprised quite a few people, performed well beyond expectations this past season. Obviously battled some injuries near the tail end of the year. Losing Ricky Rubio really hurt. The injuries to Allen, slowed things down considerably at times. So, I do think that this is a Cleveland team that kind of surpassed expectations. And now you add a true blue star to that mold in Donovan Mitchell. Again, like you said, adding a fourth all-star to this already exciting young core. And it's not like Donovan Mitchell's, in his prime years right now. He's not 30, 31 with only a few good years left in the tank. Like, you could conceivably have this core for Cleveland together for the next 5+, 6+ years if things work out. Now, the big question, right, is how do Mitchell and Garland complement each other, right? How do they fit together as a backcourt? And one of the interesting thoughts that I had, Evan, and I'm curious to know your thoughts on this, is how do those two guys potentially even pair with kind of this crazy inverse, right? Like, this past season we saw the Cavaliers running like big ball, right? Like they had so many, sizable players at times running like 3 bigs all at one time on the floor with one another. Whereas this next year, it feels like they're downsizing quite a bit more. And I'd be interested to see if they're going to even run some lineups that feature Ricky Rubio out there with Mitchell and Garland at the same time. And then obviously, Mobley and Allen kind of guarding things on the back line there.
I think that's an interesting way to look at it. To quote JB Bickerstaff, the proper term for donkey is what he would use. It would be like a big donkey lineup, but we can't swear on this network. We got to keep it PG here. So that's what JB Bickerstaff called it last year. It was weird. It was unconventional. I think the Cavs made it work because you have just a freakish defensive tandem of Mobley and Allen just blotting out the sun at the rim. And that kind of covered a lot for what Larry Markkinen lacked in terms of defense, what Darius Garland lacks in defense. I mean, even Donovan Mitchell now, but there's a lot of questions, there's a lot of variables at play. I think they could still go tall, like Dean Wade, Lamar Stevens, both power forwards in college, are being asked to play the 3 more often than not for the Cavs now. Wade shared with the media that it's been a little tough at times to make that adjustment from going from being a 4 collegiately to just being put on the wing, and they're adequate at that position. I think Lamar Stevens does a really good job. I think Isaac Okoro is going to be the biggest X factor in all this, where if he's able to be even semi-average in terms of shooting, like that's going to just pay off in spades for the Cavs, because defenses just don't keep or are not honest on the perimeter when Okoro is out there. And so just in terms of the pairing of Mitchell and Garland, I love it. To be frank, you saw it last year with Garland, especially when he said after Sexton went down, but especially after Rubio went down, the Cavs dealt with injuries. They dealt with COVID. I mean, every team does, but like the Cavs had to ask more of a lot of their players. And I think Garland rose to the task for the majority of the season, but you started to see the fact that he's only in his 3rd year in the league. This is the first time he's played such a full gambit, and every game actually means something. He's having nagging back issues that flare up against like Milwaukee and Golden State. It just kind of became a continuous issue. He was shut down for 2 weeks, I think, after the All-Star break, just to kind of rest and recover, and it was still an issue for the remainder of the season. And that's what you hoped Karis LeVert could do. And now with Mitchell, the pressure isn't so much on Garland and ask him to do more in the event there are injuries again. And as you noted, when Rubio's healthy, like that helps a little bit too. And I think that gives them some creative options. And I just think offensively, this is a really, really good tandem between the two. I think those two being close off the court and just kind of familiar with each other to begin with is just going to translate nicely chemistry wise. I do think there are going to be some growing pains in terms of just whose turn is it to shoot it, whose turn is it to handle it. Like that those are fair things. I think that Darius being used to playing with Collin Sexton a little bit helps, but again, Donovan Mitchell is a different beast than Collin Sexton at this point. So like you have to kind of change things a little bit. And I think the fact that defensively it's not going to be seamless to start the season either. I think you're going to be asking a lot more of Evan Mobley and Jared Allen just to kind of cover for those two, because Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland are both 6'1". That's going to be a turnstile on defense. And I think everyone knows that at this point. Like that's one of Mitchell's biggest weaknesses, and why Utah was able to function so well is because of Rudy Gobert. But I'm a fit. I think there's going to be some growing pains just because this is a young team who's trying to prove they belong in the Eastern Conference, and we'll just see where it's going to go. I think it's a good problem to have. I think that's my biggest takeaway is it's a good problem to have, and now it's on JB Bickerstaff and his coaching staff and the rest of this roster just to try and make these pieces fit and kind of bring in this all-star level player, because you're not bringing in a role player, you're bringing in an all-star, star level player. Like you have to kind of meet him halfway on some things. Then also Donovan Mitchell has to meet the Cavs halfway on certain things in order to make like a healthy, conducive winning environment.
I'll be curious to see if JB can keep kind of that defensive identity intact, even as you alluded to, right? Some of the concerns maybe with the perimeter defense between the duo of Garland and Donovan Mitchell. But like you mentioned as well, I mean, Gobert was the one who anchored everything for that Utah Jazz team. Very similar backcourt over there in the fact that you had 2 kind of 6'1" guys in I should say Mitchell and Mike Conley. And so it's not like the Jazz had great perimeter defenders either. And when you have a tandem duo in Jarrett Allen and Evan Mobley as your back line to kind of, just gobble up anything at the rim, guard the rim, keep a lid on the basket, that kind of thing. Hopefully the defensive identity stays intact for the Cavaliers moving forward. But you touched on Isaac Okoro there momentarily. Is he the de facto fifth starter for this Cavs team? Because to me, I think he is, right?
I would say it's an open competition. Chris Fedor, who's probably the most plugged in beat writer, said that at least for now, Karis LeVert's penciled in as the starting three for the Cavs. Maybe that's just trying to boost his trade value, but JB Bickerstaff is kind of a coach where he won't say anyone is a starter heading into training camp, and he wants it to be an open competition. But let's be frank,
Donovan Mitchell is going to have to fight for his roster spot going into training camp. It's going to be great.
But let's be frank, unless your name is Garland, Mitchell, Evan Mobley, or Jarrett Allen, I think you feel pretty safe about your chances in the starting five. I think it's going to be an open competition for the starting three. Maybe Lamar Stevens pushes them a little bit. Maybe Dean Wade, if he's healthy, pushes them as well. I think that's a good thing. I think that's a good problem to have for the Cavs because you're going to have guys pushing each other. But if I had it my way, and I've said this many times before, there's a reason why I'm on a podcast and hosting Locked On Cavs and not an NBA coaching staff. But Isaac Okoro makes a lot of sense, at least defensively, to cover some of the perimeter issues that Garland and Mitchell kind of present on the defensive side of the ball. But again, if Okoro is not able to become just a below average or even average 3-point shooter, it's really tough to have him out there because good, smart defensive teams like Boston is always my prime example. You watched Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown's taking turns sagging off of Okoro on the perimeter and kind of acting as a free safety or frustrating Garland and double teams or trapping him at the top of the key or at the top of the arc as well. You can't have that if you want to take this next step. So Okoro has to keep defenses honest. And I think it could be a bit of an ongoing thing even into the beginning of the regular season. But at least for now, Karis LeVert is probably penciled in as the starter. But Okoro is who I would prefer if I had to pick, just because of the overall defensive upside you have. And as you noted, Bickerstaff's a defense-first coach. Kind of keep with your what you're comfortable with as well.
That was the main reason I had Okoro penciled, and I'm like, as far as the defensive wings or guys that you could plug in at that fifth starter spot, I mean, Okoro just makes a lot of sense to, like you said, right, kind of cover up some of the deficiencies maybe with that starting backcourt, at least defensively. But he's got to get the three ball down to make that happen. Last thing here, Evan, and I know you touched on this a little bit earlier, right? The Cavs maybe go from like that top end play-in tournament team, 6th seed, give or take, to maybe, fighting for home court advantage, in the playoffs this next season. I just wonder, how does this Cavs team in your eyes kind of stack up with the rest of the Eastern Conference? And, does this trade really drastically impact, I guess, the timeline and maybe so the expectations for the team going into this season?
I think, yes, it does. I said this on my show. If they do not make the playoffs this year, trading for Donovan Mitchell is ultimately going to be a disappointment for this Cavs team because at least publicly, and in the fan base, it's going to create the expectation of playoffs or bust. I doubt the Cavs will publicly say, hey, it's playoffs or bust for us, and we're trying to gun for the Eastern Conference Finals or a championship, because you don't really want to put that onus on such a young and impressionable roster. Walk before you crawl. Last season was such a surprise, but let's see if you can build upon that success and not fall flat on your face next year. But to your point, I think fighting for home court advantage, at least in the first round, is semi-plausible for Cleveland. We had Martin Rickman from Dime on the show the other day, and he's just like, Miami is really aging out quite a bit. Yes, they have Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo, but the Cavs could be scrapping with them for that 4 seed. It could be a 4 or 5 battle with them, but they've passed Toronto in terms of talent right now. They've passed Chicago in terms of talent right now. They're definitely ahead of Charlotte and New York as well. But when you look at teams like Milwaukee, like teams like Boston, or even Philadelphia, and even Brooklyn as well, because they're just such a volatile wild card in themselves, it's going to be a bloodbath, as my co-host put it, where it's going to be every game is actually going to mean a lot, especially these big marquee matchups for the Cavs. And I think that makes it fun and exciting and compelling. But if you're the Cavs, you have to now weigh the options. Do we want to be as healthy as possible when we reach the postseason? Or do you want to take more of the Mike Budenholzer approach and make every regular season game matter, where we're trying to fight to be the best team record-wise? And before Donovan Mitchell was here, right around Ricky Rubio went down, the Cavs were one of the top teams record-wise in the Eastern Conference. So I think it's semi-plausible it could happen. It's just hard to really forecast how an 82-game season goes, especially when we're in the early beginnings of September right now. But yeah, I think home court advantage, at least in the first round, is very plausible. Second round, that's tough, and home court advantage at the Eastern Conference playoffs, I have to say something definitely happened to Milwaukee and Boston to make that happen.
Will the Cavaliers be fighting for a top 4 seed this next season? How will the new dynamic backcourt between Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland look once they actually make it on to the floor with one another? You're going to have us covered for all of that and more over at Locked On Cavs. Evan, I appreciate you stopping by Locked On NBA with me.
Thanks for having me, brother.